evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Julie Welch, and I'm a graduate student here at Nazareth College studying voice performance and pedagogy. This is my second year working at the Hickey Center as a graduate assistant. Our mission at the Hickey Center in the International Institute of Islamic Thought Chair for Interfaith Studies is to promote understanding and appreciation of differences through education and dialogue. This year, our focus is on how interfaith dialogue can inform and challenge the consciousness of members of the Nazareth community and the greater Rochester, New York area to stand up for racial justice in peaceful ways. We ask that you submit your questions to our speaker through the chat box and keep your microphones on mute, as our students will be moderating the question and answer section of the discussion today. This seminar is being recorded to use for educational purposes at Nazareth College. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, well, let me introduce our Vice President for Community Belonging. So Dr. Lisa, I think is known, Dr. Lisa Doran-John is known to everybody, and she is involved for a long time in since her career. I know her at Nazareth College, how she is involved in diversity issues, issues of community, issue of race and peaceful living. So she has been quite involved in this work. And I'm really pleased to see her that she has been given this position of Vice President for Community Belonging. So Lisa, I don't need to introduce you much. You are known pretty much. So please go ahead and say a few words to us on behalf of the Nazareth College.
Thank you, Dr. Shafiq, very, very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled and honored to have been invited to just share a few words regarding community and belonging, which is a division at Nazareth College dedicated towards equity issues and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what that area of the college achieves or addresses. So a few words. As we will hear tonight, the complexities of how we engage with diversity globally, nationally, and locally remains a challenge, as there is rhetoric that makes equity and anti-racism work even more challenging. The events of this year have elevated these challenges, as there is a more deep divide in how diversity work is perceived. Some will deny that it's important, and others are advancing a range of initiatives and conversations. Several years ago, Nazareth College had this very conversation, and we agreed that diversity, equity, and inclusion was mission critical for the institution, and that we needed to make it an integral aspect of all aspects of campus life. The college developed a strategic plan for diversity and inclusion, and in that plan, we articulated our commitment to DEI work. And we wanted to ensure that we would revisit this commitment on a regular basis. I want to quote a little bit from that diversity statement that was revised in 2017, because it really was a call to action of sorts. Nazareth College is dedicated to inclusion, the active pursuit of conscious and sustained practices, and values that respect difference. This commitment to diversity and inclusion informs our curriculum, our teaching, our learning, our scholarship, our creative activities, our co-curricular activities, our residential life, our community involvement, and these initiatives will be supported by the college. One of the ways that we live up to this diversity statement is through community and belonging. It doesn't all live within that particular division. We know the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, educational equity, and social justice cannot be relegated to a single person or an office. It must be a collective effort. But community and belonging's work is to lead, to partner with, or support both academic and non-academic departments on campus, so that we are very intentional in how we create or expand our curricula, how we review or revise policies that tend to be biased, and how we learn to acknowledge and respect difference. We serve as the hub for DEI work, but we are not the sole driver. Our partnership with the Hickey Center is one way that we as a campus community better understand diversity, and in particularly through an interfaith lens. Rather than keeping these conversations in a silo, we are building bridges where DEI is actualized across campus. We know this work is hard, and we will hear tonight the isms and the phobias that exist within structures of racism make the achievement of an equity-minded community hard. But with our commitment, we believe we are moving closer to what Kendi calls an anti-racist environment. We want to be an equity-minded institution. The slogan that was adopted a few years ago for community and belonging was, "Be here, be you, belong." That is certainly a tall order, and we know that it requires a great deal of work on multiple levels: relational, structural, personal. But we know that students and faculty and staff feel more engaged, more successful when they believe they belong to a community. Collectively, we're working towards that anti-racist campus. We are reconnecting with our founders' legacy of social justice, and we are celebrating that as it relates to our work in 2020. Participating in these listening, learning, and healing seminars is another way for us in community and belonging to recognize the importance of anti-racism work on campus, and it also brings attention to the importance of dismantling those ideas and structures that keep members of our community feeling like they do not belong. I am so grateful to Dr. Shafiq, and I'm grateful for the partnership with Hickey Center, and thank you for allowing me to share a few words.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lisa Doran-Jones, for this beautiful word sharing with us. Thanks a lot. And we have a number of students also present here, and as well as community members. Once again, I welcome you. And I think we have Helene. Helene, you are there, right, to introduce the keynote speaker?
Yes, Dr. Shafiq. Thank you, Dr. Doran-Jones. Good evening. My name is Helene Abdullah, and I'm a junior here at Nazareth College, majoring in biomedical sciences and with a minor in interfaith studies. This is my first year working at the Hickey Center as a student worker. After 2 years of volunteering at the Global Citizenship Conference, I'm so honored to welcome Dr. Nazia Kazi to the Hickey Center this evening. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Nazia Kazi, is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stockton University in New Jersey. Her book, Islamophobia, Race and Global Politics, has been adopted as required readings in several undergraduate courses. Her work looks at the relationship between empire, racism, and anti-Muslim violence in the United States. She has written for Al Jazeera, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Jacobin. Without further delay, please help me welcome Dr. Nazia Kazi.
Thank you so much, Helene. And the biggest thank you to the Hickey Center for Interfaith Dialogue for inviting me tonight to do this talk. I'd like to dedicate today's talk to the people of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is where I live. And if you've been watching the news the past couple days, you know that we in Philadelphia are in the midst of an uprising following the police murder of Walter Wallace Jr., a mentally ill Black man killed in front of his mother as she pled for the entire encounter to be de-escalated. The incident occurred just blocks away from where a horrible tear gas attack happened just this past summer, waged on protesters who were rising up against the murder of George Floyd. The incident occurred just blocks away from the MOVE bombing, an event so gruesome it's been scrubbed from our history books. Today, I'm going to ask that we remember our painful histories. That is the only way to heal from them. And today, as with every day, it falls upon us not to be tricked into drawing a line between good and bad protesters in Philadelphia. Everyone who takes to the street against state violence is on the right side of history. Okay, let's begin. So, there's probably a lot of students here, and my guess is that a lot of the students in attendance were not yet alive on September 11th. And if you weren't yet born, or if you're too young to remember it, you still remember it. You know in your mind's eye what it looked like. Perhaps your parents or siblings have recalled for you where they were the moment the attacks happened. And you've certainly seen the gruesome images of destruction. These images are unforgettable. They have been emblazoned in our national memory, in our collective recollection of an event that we're told to never forget. In the US, there is a whole industry of remembering 9/11. Even this past spring, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, you could buy a face mask from the 9/11 Museum gift shop that says, "Never forget" on it. And this was at a time when the coronavirus was killing as many people as died on 9/11 every day. After 9/11, pieces of steel beam from the Twin Towers were packaged and shipped all around the world. And today, there are schools, museums, and military bases that have physical pieces of the Twin Towers as memorial sites for 9/11. And I think it's worthwhile to take all of that, the never forget memorabilia, all the "where were you when the second tower was hit?" all the coloring books for kids called Dog Heroes of 9/11, to take all of those things and compare it to what we forget about 9/11. So on the one hand, we remember it quite vividly. We can all close our eyes and see probably a very similar image in our mind's eye. And yet, as I will show, our understanding of what happened is anything but vivid. Our understanding of what the attacks meant, who carried them out, the politics that led to it, and what came after, these things aren't as vivid in our mind's eye as that which we are told to never forget. So last fall of 2019, I realized that this would be the first semester that college-aged freshmen would be born after 9/11. And I wondered about these students. I wondered what kind of knowledge they had about 9/11, about the war on terror, about anti-Muslim racism. So I began to study our national memory of 9/11. Now, 32% of K through 12 teachers nationwide include any lesson at all about 9/11. Today, textbooks have more information about the Pearl Harbor attacks than about the 9/11 attacks. And when classes do have 9/11 lessons, they're all about American victimhood, the first responders and their respiratory illnesses, portraits of families who lost a loved one. Quite often, 9/11 classroom lessons are connected to the study of American exceptionalism. So you'll study 9/11 the same day you study what makes this country great. Sometimes classroom lessons have included making red, white, and blue cupcakes, or studying what the Constitution is so exceptional for, or making craft projects like huge American flags. This is the bulk of classroom lessons about 9/11. So it's no surprise then that the narratives that entire generations are being taught are, well, incomplete, to put it mildly. My study of college freshmen found that many thought Saddam Hussein was the perpetrator of the 9/11 attacks. Others thought ISIS, Pakistan, or Palestine were behind the attacks. A lot of students couldn't list a reason why the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001. A lot couldn't name a reason the US invaded Iraq in 2003. None of them could tell me what the Patriot Act was, or could tell me what happened at Abu Ghraib. So then, never forget? It seems the way we remember 9/11 means forgetting. What would it mean to never forget? Like, what would it actually mean? What would it mean to remember the deep and painful history that came before 9/11? What would it mean to remember the war on terror that came after? So this war on terror that came after 9/11 was waged in many places. For example, against the people of Somalia. And let's think a little bit about this history. Somalia has long been an area of strategic interest for the US. And during the Cold War years, the US and the Soviet Union were in competition for control over what we call the Third World. And to gain this control, the US did lots of things, including providing support for dictators during the Cold War years. And in Somalia, this was Siad Barre. Now, Barre was known to carry out horrific torture. He would imprison those who protested his rule. And he did all of this with eager support from the US. Now, the Cold War ended, but the US was still interested in Somalia. It was a strategic interest now because of its oil reserves. So in the early 1990s, when the US military went into Somalia, we, the American people, were told that this was a humanitarian intervention. We were told the US was bringing relief to the Somalis, relief from poverty, relief from violence. We were told the US was there to alleviate hunger, to remove corruption. But it was during this time that American soldiers were heard chanting, "The only good Somali is a dead Somali." And during a 1993 massacre in Mogadishu, Somali children were targets for US troops. Today, decades later, Somalia is still a playground for American empire. And this might be why, under the Obama presidency, it was discovered that there were secret prisons, black sites being operated by the US in Mogadishu. So from the point of view of the Somali people, in Somalia, I suppose it doesn't matter much whether it's George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Barack Obama, or Donald Trump in office. Both political parties are pretty closely aligned when it comes to matters of warfare. In 2017, Trump asked for a $50 billion increase in military spending. And at this time, Democratic senators were busy calling him the greatest threat to democracy, asking for a resistance to rise up against Trump. And yet when he asked for more money for his military, Democrats and Republicans agreed that the request was too low. Instead of $50 billion, they came back with an $80 billion increase, bringing the total to $700 billion. The war on terror has been waged against people like Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, a child, an American citizen, who was killed in a US drone strike ordered by Obama, and his sister Nawar, 8 years old, killed in a US drone strike ordered by Trump. Once again, the coziness of our two political parties we have to think about, especially in these few days before the election. I'm reminded of W.E.B. Du Bois's words, "There is but one evil party with two names, and it will be elected despite all I can say or do." The war on terror was waged in working class neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens. After 9/11, Muslim communities in these pockets of New York City were locked up, deported, detained, even though none were found to have any connection to a terrorist attack. The war on terror was waged against the detainees of Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, America's very own Muslims-only prison, built for $10 million by Dick Cheney's Halliburton. There, at Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, Muslims have been held without charge, indefinitely, many of them remaining incarcerated there months and years after they were cleared for release. Guantanamo Bay Detention Center is such a flagrant violation of human rights that it has to exist over there on a base in Cuba, far away from American legal protections. It is, in the words of Maha Hilal, an enduring symbol of Islamophobia. Wrote Amy Kaplan, "I believe that most Americans do not even know that it is in Cuba. They are certainly not aware that this 41-mile base even exists because of the American occupation of Cuba after the Spanish-American War. But this is how American empire works. It works by hiding itself, by relegating that which undermines its exceptionalism to invisibility. In other words, American empire works by making sure we don't remember." So let's go back to these college-age students born after 9/11, 2001. They were never taught about Somalia and Siad Barre, about Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, about Nawar, about the American politicians, businessmen who got rich by operating that illegal prison at Guantanamo. But they were taught about 9/11. They were told that 9/11 was something they should never forget. Never forget. A brand name for 9/11. And I find it curious that a global tragedy would need a slogan. But I'm forced to ask, what if we didn't forget? What if we didn't forget that the morning of 9/11, Howard Stern was on the air discussing his date with Pamela Anderson. The attacks were announced on the show, and when the second plane hits, his stylist says, "These are some towel heads How about we take these towel heads and throw them out of this country? Then Howard Stern says, we're totally too lax in this country. This is war. This is the Japanese. This is Pearl Harbor. Now is not the time to ask questions. Drop a few atomic bombs, do a few chemical warfare hits, let their people suffer until they understand. Atom bombs. Just do it so they're flattened, turned into a paved road, and we can take the oil for ourselves. So there you have it. American post 9/11 foreign policy in a nutshell. And for me, the most important part of what he said was, now is not the time to ask questions. But what if we did ask questions? What about before 9/11, 2001? What if we didn't forget the histories between the US and what we call the Middle East? Like, what if we didn't forget the most expensive, longest lasting, covert CIA operation known, Operation Cyclone? Through Operation Cyclone, the US gave millions of dollars to people in Afghanistan, known as the Mujahideen. And at the time, according to Ronald Reagan, they were freedom fighters. But decades later, after 9/11, these freedom fighters would be terrorists. So let's not forget that the US sponsored them, these Mujahideen, and sponsored specifically their flourishing trade in opium. So at the very time the US was waging a war on drugs, beginning the process of mass incarceration in Black and brown communities in the US, it was also supporting drug lords in Afghanistan. This is why people who have a keen understanding of American history laugh when people in positions of power claim to be tough on crime or have a war on drugs. And don't take my word for it. Nixon's top guy, John Ehrlichman himself, said about the war on drugs that it was entirely designed to crush Black liberation movements and to crush anti-war sentiment. So what if we didn't forget one of those drug lords in Afghanistan? Hekmatyar. Hekmatyar was known to throw acid in the faces of Afghani women who didn't cover their face. So what if we didn't forget the millions of dollars and tons of weaponry that Hekmatyar received from the US as a freedom fighter? Years later, after 9/11, Laura Bush said the US ought to invade Afghanistan to liberate its women. In other words, she wanted to liberate the very women whose repression had been US funded. And that's what we call imperialist feminism. It's why so many people use the language of liberating Muslim women to justify American foreign policy. So let's not forget that. Let's not forget that in the 1990s, UNICAL wanted to build an oil pipeline through Afghanistan. And in order to build this pipeline, UNICAL needed to repress any democratic uprisings in the area. So an official from the US State Department reflected on UNICAL's plans for the pipeline and said, there will be pipelines, there will be no parliament, no democracy, and lots of Sharia law. We can live with that. So for people who knew this history, it wouldn't land quite right when George W. Bush said the purpose of the war on terror was to spread democracy. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget that the very kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So in the US, you'll hear liberals and conservatives panicking about how in Saudi Arabia, women don't have rights, workers are mistreated, etc. But let's not forget that that very country would not exist were it not for the US State Department. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would not exist were it not for oil companies like Chevron. In fact, the US sponsored and propped up the form of Islam that is now propagated by the Saudi royal family. So whose brutality are we speaking of when we talk about Saudi Arabia's brutality? I always joke you can't even spell Saudi without USA. Now, American empire works by asking us to forget this, to forget all of this. Recently, I heard author Roberto Lovato say that states are nothing if not mass manufacturers of amnesia. And when we forget, when we suffer this amnesia, we end up seeing our country as a global force for good or a hapless victim of evil. And we begin to think that when Martin Luther King Jr. said the US was the greatest purveyor of violence on earth, that maybe his words just don't apply anymore. Again, never forget asks that we do forget. That we forget the painful histories, that a better memory, a more nuanced memory, a more contextual memory would force us to remember. Marx wrote that ideology works like a camera obscura. Karl Marx is talking about how when you look through a camera obscura, the image you see is through the pinhole is flipped perfectly upside down. And so ideology, what it does is it takes fact and it inverts it. And the dominant beliefs in a society like ours are actually the perfect inversion of what actually is. So when we believe that law enforcement are sworn to serve and protect, then we can easily label the death of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. some kind of anomaly. For Chamberlain was murdered by law enforcement after accidentally pushing the call button on his life alert system. When we believe that gentrification is urban renewal, then we can easily ignore the devastating impacts of real estate development on American cities. When we believe that merit and hard work and determination are all you need to climb the ladder, then we can overlook the gap between rich and poor, a gap that has widened in the past several decades, and now at lightning speed during the COVID pandemic. I found it so striking that my survey respondents thought the US invaded Iraq in 2003 because they had committed acts of terrorism against the US. To think that Iraq has been an aggressor against the US might be the perfect example of that inversion of reality, of that camera obscura. When George W. Bush announced the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the anti-war movement was reawakened. As a young person, it was my first time participating in demonstrations, at the time in the streets of Chicago, and I was stunned to be among tens of thousands of people marching down Michigan Avenue, blocking traffic, shutting down roads, waving signs of protest, refusing to see this unjustifiable act of violence. But yeah, my survey respondents really seemed to think Saddam Hussein did 9/11. And I remember that's kind of what they tried to tell us in 2003. And so even though Saddam Hussein nor any Iraqis had had anything to do with 9/11, it was like Muslim enough or Arab enough to somehow be guilty, nebulously guilty of terrorism. Now, I was a college student in 2003, and I remember getting into it with someone in my dorm about the Iraq war. And he was like, come on, we were attacked on 9/11. Any country would go to war. So for him and for so many Americans, it was necessary to declare war on them, as long as they were brown enough to deserve it. As Deepa Kumar writes, the fear of Islamic terrorism is manufactured to grease the wheels of empire. Now, for those of us who know history, that whole 2003 justification for the Iraq war rested on some bizarre logics. Now, some thought, okay, the US needs to get Saddam Hussein out because he's a brutal dictator. But of course, the US provides material support for dictators aplenty. And of course, the US had supported Saddam Hussein for decades, which was the reason he came to power to begin with. Some people thought the US should go to war in 2003 to get at weapons of mass destruction, weapons that didn't exist. In 2003, people looked at you funny if you reminded them that the US had given Saddam Hussein a chemicals weapons arsenal in the 1980s during his war with Iran. And of course, there's this deep history that stretches before 2003. The war waged by George H.W. Bush in Iraq, the US sanctions regime on Iraq, sanctions that starved 500,000 Iraqi children to death. So when asked on 60 Minutes about these deaths, more than died in Hiroshima, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, replied, "We think the price is worth it." Come election time in 2008, these anti-war protesters were compelled to do something, anything, to end Bush's legacy of warfare. And they turned out in huge numbers to support Barack Obama's candidacy, his campaign of hope, change. And then Obama became the biggest military president the US had seen until that point, growing the war machine in unique ways, expanding the use of drone warfare, which has killed civilians in Somalia, Yemen, and Pakistan, creating a system in which they weren't even counted as civilians, but as enemy combatants. He endorsed extraordinary rendition. He created the kill list, which allows the US president to assassinate anyone, even US citizen, without judicial process. And then, in expanding all these presidential powers, he left them now in the hands of Donald Trump. So where were those huge anti-war uprisings then? Where were the thousands who had filled the streets under Bush? Why weren't they ready to do the same when American empire had a different face? 2008, the year George W. Bush held a press conference in Iraq. And at this time, an Iraqi journalist, Muntadhar al-Zaidi, took off both his shoes and he threw them, one after another, directly at George W. Bush's head. And the incident was notorious. Everyone was replaying the hilarious footage, and around the world, al-Zaidi was hailed a hero. To this day, people have posters up of him around the world in their coffee shops and dorm rooms. And even though al-Zaidi had clearly shouted as he launched the second shoe, "This is for the widows and orphans and those killed in Iraq," Bush would later say, "I didn't know what the guy's cause was." Of course, al-Zaidi was promptly arrested and imprisoned. But okay, do we really think al-Zaidi threw those shoes at Bush and Bush alone? Because I think he threw them at Dick Cheney, Bush's vice president, whose company Halliburton made a mint off of the Iraq war. I think he threw them at Senators Clinton, Schumer, Lieberman, and all the Democrats at the time who voted for the war. I think maybe he threw them at Colin Powell, who just spoke at the 2020 Democratic National Convention this year, in spite of having lied to the UN to justify the US invasion of Iraq. I think he threw them at the New York Times, which had misled the public into supporting the war. Maybe he threw them at us too, at all of us whose tax dollars had paid for that war. So I'd like to invite everyone to accept that the histories that we are taught are incomplete, to put it mildly. And I'm sure many of you have read A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, or Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Loewen. And if you have, you're with me on this. But you know that it is painful to confront that American history that doesn't make it into our social studies books. And so people are often surprised when a talk on Islamophobia ends up being about, foreign policy. And people want to hear about discrimination against women whose headscarves are pulled off by strangers on public transportation, about the vandalism of mosques, about Muslim-owned restaurants finding racial slurs spray painted across their storefronts. And yes, these things happen. They happen all too often. But why? And once you begin to ask this question, you recognize that there are systemic bases of Islamophobia: militarism, the mythology of liberating oppressed women, the economy of fossil fuels, the enduring violence of the Cold War. And you begin to see that anti-Muslim sentiment is not Islamophobia. Anti-Muslim sentiment is a byproduct of Islamophobia. 2017, it feels like ages ago. January of 2017, when our airports were packed with protesters rallying against Donald Trump's Muslim ban. I was at the Philadelphia International Airport. Inside the airport, near the baggage claim, there was a separate protest happening, a protest within the protest. The people of color had gathered inside the airport and were having a sit-in. And the sit-in was different from the protest that was happening outside. See, outside, protesters stood behind a police barricade across from the airport. Inside, the protesters were chanting, "The Fraternal Order of Police endorsed Donald Trump." And inside, one speaker said, "White liberals are scared of Donald Trump because he might make them know what it's always felt like to be Black in America." And his comments struck me as a reminder that for those most excluded and demonized in America's racial order, the rise of Trump isn't shocking. It isn't un-American. It's the America we've been marching toward all along. When George W. Bush waged that war on terror, he was laying the groundwork for a Trump presidency. And before Bush, when Bill Clinton won the presidency by executing a mentally ill Black man, he too was laying the groundwork for a Trump presidency. The problem is, we choose to see in our political system binaries instead of continuities. We want to think it's this guy versus that guy instead of those guys versus us. Like, take this, for example, building a wall, right? 4 years ago at Trump rallies, people were chanting, "Build a wall." Building a wall at the US-Mexico border appealed to people, many of them who know very little about the dirty wars that the US waged across Latin America, wars that were directly responsible for migration to the United States. But of course, his promise to build a wall offended people like civil rights advocates, immigrants, who found the notion of walling off the US to be stupid, offensive, and primitive. But here's the problem, that that wall was being built before Trump's political career. This fence, this barricade, which runs along the California-Mexico border, well, Trump was promising to build a wall that those who came before him, Republican, Democrat, had already begun constructing. It was under Bill Clinton that construction of it began. Hillary Clinton, as senator, voted in support of the Secure Fence Act of 2006. And we have to ask, where were the protests then? Where were the signs that say no walls on stolen land? Where were they when the wall was beginning to be built? Why only under Trump was there such widespread opposition? And these questions are crucial for us as we look ahead at an Islamophobic presidential election. I mean, regardless of the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, Islamophobia will remain the law of the land. So a lot of people are very excited about the historic election ahead, seeing a woman of color up for the position of VP, and that certainly is historic. But we also have to ask, would she be on that ticket had she, just in the midst of the COVID economic crisis, voted for the tiny decrease in the military budget to reinvest in our communities instead of against it? Would she have made it there if she didn't have a close relationship with the Center for a New American Century, a pro-war think tank that has led to much expanded US militarism? Would she have made it there had she not been responsible as DA for incarcerating countless Black people, mostly working class and poor? Writing about the election in 2016, Professor Zilla Eisenstein wrote, "Imperialist feminism is a feminism that operates on behalf of American empire building. It has a history of using the Western notion of women's rights to justify American wars, most recently in Afghanistan and Iraq. Imperialist feminism imposes rather than negotiates, dominates rather than liberates, declares itself the arbiter of women's needs, and operates on behalf of the hierarchies of class across the globe, leaving most women out of the mix." Those words hit hard right now, a few days before this election. I think it behooves us to really broaden our definition of Islamophobia. We must include in our definition of Islamophobia sanctions passed by wealthy nations, such as the US, that have kept countless Muslims from accessing basic necessities, food, school supplies, medicine. We must include in our definition of Islamophobia the menacing presence of military bases on foreign soil. I'm just reading this book by David Vine, The United States of War. It's fantastic so far. He really traces out the history and implications of US military bases around the world. You'll note that while the US has 800 military bases on foreign soil, no foreign country has a military base on US soil, which is peculiar. We must include in our definition of Islamophobia those unmanned planes that carry out drone strikes, killing Muslim civilians, again, whose lives don't even get counted as civilians. We must include in our definition of Islamophobia the totalitarian monarchs in Gulf countries who receive eager support from the United States, even as they carry out public beheadings or repress democratic uprisings. If we want to understand Islamophobia at all, we have to push ourselves to think beyond bigotry or the prejudice of individuals. You know, when I teach my class Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration and ask students to jot down a definition of racism, 9 times out of 10, students will write a definition that locates racism in the hearts and minds of an individual. So their definition of racism will be being prejudiced towards someone from a different background than you. Their definitions rarely mention the material basis of racism, the likelihood that there's lead in your drinking water, the likelihood that you will be incarcerated for a low-level offense in your lifetime, you know, and we must expand our definition to include this material basis. So if we are going to understand Islamophobia, we have to push ourselves to think beyond bigotry and prejudice and push ourselves to see beyond the pageantry of people in positions of power who may host Ramadan dinners while they carry out anti-Muslim policy. We must push ourselves to see the Islamophobia that is perpetrated by the state We must push ourselves to see the Islamophobia that is paid for by our tax dollars. And we must push ourselves to see our own tragic and often invisible complicity. Thank you so much for letting me share my comments, and my favorite part is when we get to have some discussion. So I hope folks are not shy that are in attendance today. I can go on and on and on, but I always love hearing from folks in attendance.
Thank you, Dr. Kazi. You have given our guests so much to consider. Guests, I invite you to type any questions you may have for our keynote speakers and panelists into the chat box, and our student will moderate the discussion. As a reminder that we ask that you keep your microphone on mute in order for all to hear clearly. Thank you again for joining us.
You know, I tend to move away from defining Islamophobia as a religious clash. I think that it actually does us a great disservice to see anti-Muslim violence as a product of religious bigotry. And instead, we get a better definition when we understand that Islamophobia is a form of racism. Now, to understand what that means, we have to understand what race itself is. And all too often, people think that race is like a biological fact. It's something that's in your blood type or your DNA. For those who think that, go check out, I'm sure your library has a copy of the documentary Race, the Power of an Illusion, which is so great and does a great job of debunking that notion of, scientific race. Race is a man-made, human-made social construct. In other words, race is something that was largely invented alongside and deeply connected to the rise of Western imperialism and colonialism, right? And so when we understand racism in these ways, it's less about, intolerance between people who just can't seem to get along, or Christians versus Muslims, and instead it becomes more about what does painting a certain population as somehow subhuman, what does dehumanizing a population do for the way wealth and power are distributed in a society, right? And then we can begin to ask some really interesting questions when we start to see race in those ways, right? There's a great definition from Roger Sanjak in their book, Sanjak and Gregory's book, Race, that is a definition of race, which is race is a framework of categorizing humans that was invented in Western Europe at the dawn of imperialism, right? And you can read The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter and Lee Baker's terrific work on the construction of race to really get a good sense of what it meant to invent race, okay? The creation of racial categories was a project that can be rooted in a small handful of countries that really stood to benefit a lot by painting certain segments of the world as primitive, as savage, as worthy of being enslaved or wiped out or dominated, right? And if you look at even Linnaeus, and I'm sure many of you learned about Linnaeus, the Swedish scientist in your biology classes, as the person who invented taxonomy, right? Like where you organize different animals into different categories. But he also did that for humans, and he believed that humans could be categorized into 5 different racial groups. And of course, the European race, according to Linnaeus, had a stronger aptitude for philosophical reasoning, for creating systems of government and civilization. Like it was a very self-serving system, right? And I speak as an anthropologist, which is tricky because anthropology has a really messed up history in that regard. The discipline of anthropology was largely invented as what Professor Talal Asad has called, the handmaiden to colonialism. In other words, anthropologists were meant to explain those natives, those savages, to European colonial forces so they could better dominate them. And in doing so, anthropologists and scientists tried to create a scientific basis for race. In other words, they tried to prove through very faulty science. And you can read a book called The Skull Collectors if you want to learn more about, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and Norton and all these people who obsessively collected skulls of different races and then measured them through phrenology to prove that some races had a larger, cranium than others, and therefore we're more intelligent. So for me, I think it's important to understand Islamophobia as a part of this centuries-long racial project, rather than being caused by American Christians or any particular group, that actually it's a much larger systemic issue that helps us make sense of how wealth is distributed in society. I mean, think about it. A lot of people say, you know, Donald Trump is an Islamophobe. People will say that. Okay, sure, maybe. But you all remember when he was doing that sword dance with the Saudi royal family and he put his hand on that orb with the Saudi royals, right? And then in that instance, is he an Islamophobe? Or is Islamophobia less about demonizing Muslims and more about dividing up Muslims based on the ones that are useful to empire and those who should be targeted by it, right? And I think it's more useful to think about Islamophobia in those terms, which is what we mean when we say racism is systemic. So in France, there is, well, in Western Europe, there is a very long history. So Muslims believe that to have a caricature or a drawing of the Prophet Muhammad is deeply offensive and violates a very important religious principle. But that's only part of the picture. The other part of the picture is that there is a long-standing colonial history between France and North Africa. If you go to Paris, there are neighborhoods in Paris that are ghettoized, that are poor, you know, poorer communities of Black North African Muslim immigrants living in France. Why are they living in France? Well, there's this thing that happens, which is when you colonize a place, people from that colony end up living in your country. That's why when you go to the UK, you see people from India there. When you come to the US, you see people from Mexico here. Migration and colonialism go hand in hand. That's a history you can trace in Roberto Lovato's book. It's a history you can trace in Harvest of Empire by Juan Gonzalez and countless other books I could list. So when you see Muslims reacting in ways that seem truly despicable, as we've seen in France recently, it doesn't do us any good to take the historical context away from it. This is a much bigger issue than a drawing alone. It is it is seen as an offensive act by a population that has been brutalized by the French state in France and through the colonial history of France. Now, none of this is meant as a justification for anything. It is meant as context for getting a deeper history, a more nuanced historical understanding of what's happening, right? And so this is important. I mean, quite often people think that American racism is somehow unique. So for instance, anytime people are frustrated with the political system in the US, they'll be like, I'm moving to Canada. And I'm like, well, Canada is a settler nation. The Canadian Royal Mounted Police have been shoot to kill orders at Indigenous people trying to protect their native land from building gas pipelines through them. You know, that in the West, we see a huge legacy of imperialism, colonial violence that shapes not just the US, but huge swaths of the West, right? And so Catherine Ewing, a lot of folks have written really good stuff about European Islamophobia that helps make sense of these kinds of issues. Do something. Is that something voting? Well, we have a huge toolbox as Americans of things that enact change in our world. We could put voting in that toolbox. We could put organizing worker collectives, unions, in that toolbox. We could put engaging in housing justice action in that toolbox. We could put organizing debt strikes in that toolbox. And when we look at history, and when we look at American history, it becomes clear that most change has been driven outside of the ballot box and outside of the political process. So if you're voting next week, take the few minutes that it takes to vote and vote, or if you're mailing in your ballot, drop it off at a ballot box. And you got to ask yourself, what is the rest of the 98% of your political activity? Because on that list of all the things that have pushed for change in the US, the more I study, the more it seems that voting is lower on the list in terms of what has impacted change. Now, let me give you some examples. I'm from Illinois, which is known as the land of Lincoln. They love them some Lincolns in Chicago, right? And I was always taught that Lincoln emancipated the slaves, that Lincoln freed the slaves. And yes, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation ending slavery, but he didn't really want to do it. He was kind of like, if you read Howard Zinn's book, he quotes Lincoln at length saying, look, I would never say that Black and white races are equal. I would never say that. In fact, Lincoln predicted maybe slavery would end, but it would have to be really gradual and it wouldn't happen until the 1960s. So why did he sign the Emancipation Proclamation ending slavery? It's because angry, organized, educated people held his feet to the fire. White and Black abolitionists forced him to. That has been what has pushed the political needle in the US. Angry, organized, educated masses of people. And when Malcolm X said, by any means necessary, he meant by any means necessary, right? I mean, if you read Malcolm X's own speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, you see he's saying we need to use all the political tools we have, which can include voting, but they can include organizing our workplaces. I mean, think about, I'd urge everyone to look up the work of Richard Wolff and how he talks about democratizing our workplaces. I'd urge everyone to read the history of the 1880s and 90s and see what mining workers were doing at the time. Again, these histories that were not taught in our social studies classes are the ones that are the most provocative to me. And they're very different from the civics lessons classes we get about writing letters to our elected officials, right? And they ask us to take a different approach to our past in the US, which again has been driven by mass movement. I'm reminded of a quote from Noam Chomsky. If you haven't read any Chomsky, go read some Chomsky. But here's this quote from him. He says, the best way to keep people passive and obedient is to limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion and then allow lively debate within that spectrum. So when you watch, well, the presidential debates are done, but when I watch them, it's more interesting to ask what they're not being asked than see how they are answering the questions they are being asked. It's more interesting to think about what they agree on than what they differ on and what that reveals about the American political system. So I'd urge everyone to go read, it's a quick article, you can read it in 2 minutes, Election Madness, also by Howard Zinn, where he answers this question, vote or don't vote, okay? And then see how you feel, and then ask yourself the question, which is, what do I do as a political being that doesn't exist around our electoral system? What is my political life that is not in the 2 minutes I spend punching a ballot? And that is a far more important question than what you punch on that ballot. You know, I would urge people to be very cautious when jumping to a conclusion of genocide. And the reason I say that is because we as Americans have a great burden that we carry. And you know, in my classes, all the classes I teach, cover the question of indigeneity, rather the question of Native people on this land. It's a question that comes up a lot. Is what happened on US soil to the Native people a genocide or not? And you can't, because you saw 3 anti-Christopher Columbus memes on Instagram, jump to saying, yeah, we are, because you're answering a very heavy question there, right? You have to ask, what is the history of Native people here? And I think it's one that often gets erased by people who arrived later along the timeline to this land. And it's a history that is often erased. I mean, look, the erasure of after my study, I believe that there was a genocide of Native peoples in the New World that happened. And I urge you to do your own study, arrive at your conclusions. But for me, what's really interesting is how that gets like wiped out again of our telling of history. So most people don't know that the US government made over 500 treaties with Native American people and violated every single one of them, right? I'm reminded of, for instance, what happened at Standing Rock in just 2016. So 4 years ago, last election cycle, Native American people were fighting to protect their treaty-protected land at Standing Rock, where they were trying to build a gas pipeline, violating the US's own treaty. And if we cannot first grapple with the question of genocide, and I'd urge people to read Ward Churchill's A Little Matter of Genocide. I'd urge people to read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States, and countless other books that have been written about that erased history of what happened on Native land. And I think that we need to take that question on first, before we begin quickly slapping on the allegations of genocide for any population that's being marginalized or brutalized in any way. So I think it's an important question, but I think it's one we have to put a lot of weight on, right? Is how do we deal with the question of genocide? Racism is pretty universally practiced, but that doesn't mean that racism is timeless. Sometimes I'll see these student essays that are like, racism has been around since the beginning of time. And as I said earlier, you know, race is a social construct that was born out of the needs of capital and empire. So US racism is peculiar, and it's less interesting to me to think of which places are more or less racist. We don't want to start playing oppression Olympics, as they call it, you know, but people will often be like, oh, France, they're so racist, or the Netherlands, but the US is worse than this and that. I don't know if that's as useful as understanding systemic racism and the ways it shows up in society, right? So for instance, in the US, I mentioned in my talk, the war on drugs. So the war on drugs was this nationwide effort to criminalize drug use and sale. It seemed like a good idea to a lot of US politicians at the time. Of course, we know now, looking back, that it wasn't the best. For instance, when Portugal saw a huge heroin addiction epidemic, their solution was to decriminalize all drugs and spend money on addiction treatment programs, and they basically cured the problem. What we did here was we built huge, massive prisons. Now, if you haven't read Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? Make that the next thing you do in life, okay? If it doesn't blow your mind, I'll buy you coffee. Or read Michelle Alexander's, of course, The New Jim Crow. Classic books that tell us that what ended up happening was in the 1970s and 80s, the US economy was deindustrialized. In other words, a lot of our jobs were sent elsewhere. And so people who had used to have a robust manufacturing job, and back then a manufacturing job meant one parent in a 4-family household could work and buy a house in the suburbs and send kids to college. The good old days, huh? And when those jobs were sent elsewhere, we saw a huge underclass in the US that would sort of become a permanent underclass created. And you had all these bodies who were plunged into poverty, some of them in Black and brown communities, Black communities in places like the South Bronx or Brooklyn, some of them in poor white towns in upstate New York. Now I know a lot of you are in upstate New York. If you were to go to upstate New York in the 1950s and say, can we build a massive prison here? People will be like, hell no. In the 1970s and 80s, the answer was quite different. It was sure, yes, jobs. So in the economic shift that happened through something that we call neoliberalism, underclass was created that was both Black and white. And the way this was solved was by locking up a lot of the folks who were Black and employing a lot of people who were white and poor in that system of mass incarceration. So for me, it's less interesting to think about which society is more or less racist, and it's more interesting to think about, oh, look at that very unique form of racism that was engineered in the US through the war on drugs. We know that drug usage in the US is very similar across racial groups. There is no group that does drugs more than another group, but the people who are incarcerated tend to be Black and to a certain extent Latino folks who are incarcerated for drug use, which reveals an interesting feature of what we call de facto racism in the US, right? So for me, those are always more provocative questions than, you know, more or questions of more or less. Well, so in the US, when we speak of civil rights, we're usually talking about, you know, 1954 to 1968. 1954 to 1968, sometimes I'm really sad I wasn't around then in this period of history that was so remarkable. And the reason I'm sad that I wasn't around then is because in being taught about the civil rights era, I realized that I was kind of lied to. like Rosa Parks. Man, I was taught about Rosa Parks from the time I was like 5 years old. And I was taught that she was a tired seamstress who refused one day to give up her seat on a segregated bus. And I was old when I read Jean Theo Harris's The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks, which will blow your mind. Okay, so CNN, on what would have been Rosa Parks' 100th birthday, did a portrait of her life where they said she was hardly a troublemaker. And I'm like, that's not the history that I read about when I started poking around in the political history of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a troublemaker, and I mean that in the good way. That she was the first woman member of the NAACP, that she came from a family that was in the tradition of Marcus Garvey, important preacher, right, who influenced Malcolm X's family and countless other important figures in the civil rights, that Rosa Parks' grandfather would sleep on the front porch with a loaded rifle because he was scared of being targeted by the Klan because of his Garveyist beliefs, that Rosa Parks was vocal against the Vietnam War, that Rosa Parks considered Malcolm X to be her civil rights icon. In fact, she said he was the person that she admired the most, a militant anti-racist figure like Malcolm X. And to me, I'm like, whoa, she was a troublemaker. How along the way did she get turned into a tired old lady who didn't want to give up her seat? So this question about Islamophobia and the civil rights movement is interesting because for me, the civil rights movement has been twisted and watered down. And in the words of Cornel West, if you haven't read any Cornel West, make sure you do. Cornel West says, we took our civil rights movement and we sanitized, deodorized, and watered it down. And I think that's absolutely true, right? Because what I was taught of Martin Luther King Jr. when I was growing up was he gave a speech saying, I have a dream that my Black children will be able to sit next to white children. And then I got older and I started reading Martin Luther King and I said, oh, he was a democratic socialist. And he drew heavily from the principle of satyagraha, which he got from Gandhi. And that he, talked about very passionately about an end to US empire, that he had three principles, right? Anti-racism, that's the one we're taught about. Sometimes they call it integration. But anti-war or anti-US empire was another pillar, and anti-poverty or anti-capitalism was another pillar. And those are the two parts of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy that I was never taught, and I was robbed of that education. And now I stay up spending my life trying to catch up on it because it is way more rad than the version we're taught. And my worry is that with our understanding of Islamophobia, we have a tendency to do the same thing, that we have a tendency to water it down and turn it into, oh, if everyone just knew why Muslims fast in the month of Ramadan, then we would do away with Islamophobia. If everyone knew what the hijab was about and what people do when they perform the Hajj, then we could do away with Islamophobia. And right? That we want to keep this from being watered down. We want to keep a material focus. And by that, I mean, we want to keep our focus on how power works in the world, whether we're talking about civil rights or whether we're talking about Islamophobia. That is a really great question. And I think it's a tough one because I don't encounter students until they're in college, which is A, not a place everyone gets to go. And B, at that point, a lot of people have already formed their worldviews in a certain way. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who was a fifth grade teacher at the time 9/11 happened. And these fifth graders showed up the day after September 11 saying, bad guys got us. And she said, okay, wait, hold on. And she pulled down a map and she started showing them where different parts of the world were and talking about the histories of these places. And you better believe she got called into the principal's office the next day because troubled parents were calling, asking why she was having these conversations with her young students. And I have tremendous sympathies for people who are working with younger students, younger learners, high school, middle school, elementary school. I think the one thing we do have to understand is that young people have a tremendous capacity for learning things. Sometimes we think, we shouldn't tell young people the ugly stuff. But the thing is, we already do, right? I read The Diary of Anne Frank at a very young age, and it's a really touching, chilling, and scary story. But I don't think I was taught about, the history of lynching in the United States. I mean, much bigger than what we're ever taught. If you read Brian Stevenson's report on lynching in America, you're like, whoa, the US was lynching, people were being lynched for wearing their military uniform. Mexicans were lynched in the US for speaking Spanish. Arab Syrians were lynched. I mean, of course, the bulk were African Americans, and that, I was taught the Great Migration was people moving to the north for jobs, but I was never taught the Great Migration was people fleeing terrorism, racial terrorism in the South. So I think that we have to trust that our young people can actually learn these histories. And this is largely what motivated me to write the book that I wrote, Islamophobia, Race and Global Politics, which is, I will say, an easy read. It's not typically what you're expected to write as like a new-ish professor. You're supposed to write like an academic book based on your dissertation. And I kind of was like, no one wants to read that. I want to write something that you can give a high school senior and they can pick it up and digest it, but you haven't dumbed down the message. Because all too often when we try to teach about race, we end up watering down the message and turning race into an issue of like tolerance and understanding. And I'm like, no. Let us trust young readers to understand the politics of empire, to understand the politics of race, and to do that, right? So that's largely what I would take as an approach to talking to young learners. Yes, so I would urge everyone to read Deepa Kumar's Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire. It's one of my favorite books, and she's a brilliant scholar. I wonder if maybe she can come visit you sometime too. And her book really traces out the history of Islamophobia from its roots in the Crusade, right? And the Crusade is largely when some of these proto-Islamophobic ideas sort of cemented, where it was like, those are the barbarians over there. Those are the savages, the infidels over there. And we are, the defenders of civilization. I would also urge people to think about 1492 in a new way. I mean, here we're taught 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, blah, blah, blah. But of course, it took me forever to learn Columbus never actually landed in North America. Like, he made it to the Caribbean islands. In fact, one of the first places he landed was Guantanamo Bay, but he went to the Caribbean islands. He never made it here to mainland, to North America, even though he's such an important and for many people beloved figure in the US. But 1492 was also the year the royal decree was issued by the Spanish crown, saying Spain is a Catholic nation, and if you don't like it, you can leave or you can die. So for the minorities at the time, Jewish people, but also Muslims who had previously ruled Spain, the Moorish people, for centuries, and other minorities, gay people, the Roma people, like all these people were asked to either leave or convert to Catholicism or be executed. And when we talk about the Spanish Inquisition, a lot of these Islamophobic views are also coming from that point, right? And I remember I was in Barcelona several years ago, and I noticed this like decorational motif in a lot of like restaurant windows where there would be like a slab of what looked like a slab of raw meat hanging in the window. It's fake. It's like a decoration thing. I thought it was quirky. So I talked to a historian about it who told me that back during the Crusades, they used to hang a dead pig in eating establishments. And because Muslims and Jewish people do not eat pork, if you refuse to enter that eating establishment, that could be used as evidence against you in an Inquisition trial. You could be executed for that. And to me, that stuff still exists to this day as a decorational motif that most people don't know the history of is a really interesting remnant of the deep roots of racism. The Inquisition is really remarkable to study. If you ever get a chance to visit Granada or Andalusia in the south of Spain, you can see firsthand some of this history. The Spanish crown at the time, they were looking for crypto Muslims and crypto Jews, people who were secretly still practicing, their religion after the royal decree had been given. And all kinds of things were used as evidence against them. For instance, if there was evidence that you bathed regularly, that was probably proof that you were a Muslim and could be executed, because of course Muslims wash up before their daily prayers, but also fully bathe before Friday prayers. And Catholics at the time were not doing that. And so when you study these deeper roots of racism, it reveals some really interesting pieces of history that I find really compelling. Yes. In terms of the ethos of never forget being the opposite of what really is, let's remember that Donald Trump's political career is much deeper than we often remember. So a lot of people think Donald Trump's political career started when he accused Obama of not being a real American. So the birther controversy, which did launch his political career in a huge way, right? Because he obviously was casting doubt on whether or not Obama was US born, forcing him to produce a birth certificate. And that sparked a political movement we call the birther controversy. But it was in the 80s that he took out a full-page ad asking New York to bring back the death penalty, to execute the Central, well, they used to be called the Central Park Five. Now we call them the Exonerated Five, because these were children whose lives were robbed of them because they were falsely, they were completely cheated by the criminal justice system and spent decades in prison for a crime they did not commit. That was the launch of his political career. Donald Trump has had a long political career, and at every turn, it invokes race, right? That it's been difficult for Trump to deliver a lot of things to his base, because as you can see, we're in economic crisis, a crisis of capitalism. We are experiencing record levels of inequality. I heard a statistic recently, by the way, that if Amazon gave every single employee at Amazon a $100,000 bonus, Jeff Bezos would still be as rich as he was at the start of the pandemic. That's how much money Amazon made because we needed to buy N95s and toilet paper on Amazon, or we were scared to go to the grocery store. So, you know, in this economic crisis, the one thing Donald Trump has been allowed to offer his base is racism. I live in Philadelphia. Donald Trump says bad things happen here. And that's like coded racial language. If you haven't, you can read Ian Haney Lopez's Dog Whistle Politics, which is like a really terrific book about how people use racial code words in political speech. You know, there are going to be, it seems there will be certain places where there are armed people patrolling polling places next week, which is scary. And so this has been what he has been able to offer his base is, you know, racial promises, since the economic promises were not delivered.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kazi. You covered quite a bit historically how racism has come into its existence and how racism has played its role and still playing its role, and how U.S. empire has played their own role, especially in dividing the world and promoting Islamophobia in one way or another. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We see that we still have some time, but we don't see much questions left. So I think we got enough for tonight to think over it, what it means to
so much. It was lovely to be here. I really appreciate the chance to join you virtually, and I hope to see you in person.
Well, it will happen one day. I think I see quite a few of our professors are there, and they are very much. So we'll see. We'll talk about it. But for all of us, whether we are students or community members, let's think about it. I really like this. All the reforms which has come is, well, vote does matter. We have to vote. I voted already, by the way. But you know, it's organizational work that we can do. That's what I like. If you look into the history of the world, things have changed. The change has come through organizational networking, working together for common cause, for things which can help humanity as a whole, not just one segment of humanity, but humanity as a whole. If we stand together, we will make a difference. So I think that's a very good lesson. After vote, and whatever the results of the votes are, whosoever is elected, our work is not finished. Because, you know, as you know, I'm co-chair of the Commission on Race and Structural Equity in the Monroe County. You can see it's a deep down. This is my first time studying how really it is deep down and how really it is organized, and to get out of it is a very difficult job. to bring that equity which we are thinking is a very hard job. It needs a lot of education. And I think what Dr. Kazi brought it is education starts from schooling and from college, young people to read more, all aspects, not just one aspect, all aspects make up your mind how to help humanity, how to do things which are civil and which are humanitarian. So that is, and for this work, when you organize, compassion is the first thing to have. To be a compassionate person and how to heal the world. So thank you very much, Dr. Kazi. We really appreciate your speaking to us and this community. And we had quite a few people from outside also, not from Rochester area, but from other states, from other cities also. And to all of you, thank you very much for participating. To the students, to the Nazareth community, and to the community at large, thank you. Wishing you the best. Sleep well, and in the morning, make intention to do something good for the world.